Hey crafters, welcome back to my channel Because I'm Crafting. My name is Katelyn, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about some tips and tricks when making coats or jackets. So recently I've been making one of my Make 9 goals, which was to make a pink coat. I had some fabric that I'd been hoarding for a long time. I literally had the fabric, the lining, the buttons, the snaps, the shoulder pads, and the pattern all ready to go, and it's just been sitting in a bag for a really long time. And I think in my Make 9 video I had said that I wasn't sure if I was going to use the pattern as an inspiration to draft a pattern or just use the pattern itself. And I just went ahead and used the pattern because I was feeling lazy, and I actually do really just like the pattern as it is, so I thought I'll just go ahead and make it as is. And the pattern I think was from the 70s, so I was a little bit worried about how it was going to come together just because sometimes vintage patterns don't fit very well. But it's actually been going really well. I'm not completely finished. I'd contemplated making this video either during making my coat or when it was completely finished, but I decided that since I'm not completely done yet, it might be good to do it now because I can actually still get inside and show you guys some of the things that I'm talking about. And then I have a coat that I made a couple years ago, I think. Man, it's been a long time. Anyways, it's been just sitting in my Etsy shop for a long time because I have not been working on my Etsy shop at all. But I still have it, and I just thought I would bring it down as well to show you guys kind of the finished product and some of the things that I talk about with the one I haven't finished you can see on the finished version. So I'm just going to follow along with my book. I've written down a bunch of tips and things to think about when sewing a coat. And I'm going to be talking a lot about a fully lined jacket or coat. So just keep that in mind. Some of these may come in handy for more simpler versions, but that's just what I'm going to be talking about today. So let's get into it. So I chose to do it against my white wall today because my coats are very bright, and I thought doing it against my red wall you just won't be able to see very well. So I hope that's a little bit different and okay for you guys. But the first thing I have written down is your fabric. So pre-shrinking or treating your fabric whichever way you need to, whether that's just washing it or pre-shrinking it with just steam from your iron. Especially if it's wool, you just want to pre-treat your fabric whatever way is appropriate for your fabric. So like I said, if you're using wool, you want to take an iron and steam it really well so that it's almost damp, and then hang it to dry, and that kind of takes the shrinkage out of the wool. If it's a fabric you can wash, then you can go ahead and wash it like you would any other fabric, especially for your lining as well, get that pre-shrink out. Depending on your coat, sometimes I don't pre-shrink or pre-treat my fabric. If it is a wool, I definitely will do the iron treatment. But if it's a different kind of fabric and it's not something that I'm necessarily going to throw in the wash anyways, it's something that I'm going to get dry cleaned, then I won't always do that, but I definitely recommend doing it, especially if you can just wash it. Just throw it in, give it a quick wash, and then you know that you're good to go. But if it's something that I know I'm not actually going to be washing later, I would probably just dry clean once a year or something like that, then I'm not too worried about it. But wool, especially, steam your wool. Number 2, I have written down interfacing. Now there's a lot of different things that you can interface in a coat or jacket, and depending on your fabric, the structure that you're looking for, and just the overall shape of the style that you're making, interfacing is really important, and do not skip out on your interfacing. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of go extreme with your interfacing, or the more technical tailoring way, or you can kind of go a simpler version and not interface completely everything and still get a very similar look. Again, depending on the style of your coat. If you're making like a very super tailored blazer, that's a lot different. I'm kind of thinking of a simpler version of a jacket or coat, like a nice fall coat, more of a dressy coat, even a simpler fall or spring coat. I'm not really talking about super tailored blazers, so just keep that in mind. But some of my top areas to interface are, of course, your facings. You definitely want to interface your front and back facings, or if you have sleeve facings or hem facings, definitely interface those. Interface any areas where you're going to have a closure. So your front facings will be part of that usually, but I also like to interface the outer fabric in the area where a closure is going to be attached, especially if you're sewing buttons through, putting buttonholes on. You also want to interface that outer layer. The other thing I have written down is your hem. So if you don't have a sleeve hem or hem facing, you want to interface the outer fabric where you're going to be folding it up. You want to interface your pocket areas. So any area that has a pocket, you want to do the outer fabric and your facing on both sides of the pocket. I also like to interface my neckline. So not just the facing, but the neckline itself. It just makes the outer fabric lay nice and flat. And also the shoulder seams as well. So you can kind of do it two different ways. You can put a strip of interfacing on either side of your front and back, and then when you sew your shoulder seam together, that whole seam will be interfaced, and then you can do your neck separately. Or what a lot of people like to do is interface kind of from the waist up, so that will stabilize your arm's eye, your shoulder, your neckline, and your center front, and then a lot of people just carry down a line of interfacing down the front. Another place that can be really helpful for making your sleeve sit right is interfacing your sleeve cap. So kind of just like midway down. You can kind of do it curved or straight across, but just interfacing that sleeve cap with, I would suggest, a lighter interfacing will just give that sleeve cap a nicer kind of curve. If you do something too stiff, it won't want to make that nice curve where you have your ease and everything in your shoulder. And of course you want to highly interface your collars and your under collars. Whatever type of collar you have, that is usually the focus of your jacket or coat, so you want to make sure that that sits nice and crisp. So I'm just going to grab my coat and show you guys some of those spots that I'm talking about. The one thing I haven't done is the shoulder cap, and I will show you what I mean when you don't interface. Again, depending on your fabric, sometimes they sit really nicely, and like mine is not sitting so nicely. So this is the pink coat that I'm working on for my Make 9. So I have the collar in, sleeves in, pockets in, and my lining in, and my back is all finished. So the only thing I have left are the sleeve hems, the bottom hem, and my closures down the front. But I am going to go back and take out my sleeve caps. Actually, one side is actually sitting really well and the other one isn't. Sometimes that happens, but as you can see on this one here, it's making this weird bubble, and I tried to press it as best I could, but it did not help it at all. And on the front, it's kind of doing a weird pull thing as well. This side is sitting a lot better than the other side. It's not perfect, but it's sitting better. So I think see, it's kind of creating that nice ease in the back. I think I'm going to go back and take out both of them and redo the interfacing for those. The other thing that may be affecting this shoulder as well, that I can kind of see here, there's kind of a dip right here, and I do have my shoulder pad pinned in there, and I think I need to push it out more into, this way, into the cap of the sleeve to kind of hold it out further. Or another thing that I need to do is add a piece of fleece into my shoulder cap, so that's something that I'll show you in a minute, but that will also help your shoulder kind of sit out properly. So this is what can happen with certain types of fabrics if you don't use interfacing in some kind of key parts. So this is just a twill fabric, but you can see it is not happy there. So I'm just going to pull it out and show you some other places that I've interfaced. So I've interfaced my hem, and I've already pressed it to where I want it to be. Like that. I have yet to do my sleeve hems, but that's something I am going to be doing. My collar upper and lower is both interfaced. My neck facing, interfaced. My shoulders are interfaced. I just did strips for this one because I wasn't sure how the fabric was going to sit. I've got my shoulder pad pinned in. I'm going to talk to you guys about that in a second. Let me get in the front here. And I've got actually my center front and my facing interfaced with a stretch fusible interfacing, so it's a little bit more lightweight and has some more movement because I didn't want there to be a stark line down the front, and I didn't have enough of the woven fusible interfacing, which is what I used for my hem, to go down the entire front. So I would have liked to use that especially for my facing. I did at the top and around the neckline here, and I kind of stopped midway down and then switched to the other interfacing. You can kind of see there. So that's on my facing, just so that the top had a little bit more structure where the collar kind of comes down and has that front point. So kind of pull it back out here. So you can see here. So I basically have this, my front facing, down the front to about here is the woven fusible, and then down below is the stretch. I really like that stretch interfacing. It's a little bit more lightweight, has some more movement, and yeah, so those are places to interface. I did my pockets as well with the woven, just to kind of hold it in place a little bit better. Another thing you can do for your pockets is add a piece of twill tape in when you do your understitching. It'll just help that edge roll under really nicely. Thankfully with this fabric, it presses extremely well, so I didn't need to do that step, and I've interfaced it really well, so I didn't feel the need to do that. But I have every side of this pocket is interfaced, so it should lie nice and flat when it's hanging. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is shoulder pads. So make sure that you have the right thickness of shoulder pad for the pattern. If it doesn't say, you can usually go with a 1/2 inch is kind of a good baseline to start. But when you draft coat and jacket patterns with a shoulder pad, it's drafted for a certain thickness of shoulder pad. So if you get too thick or too thin, it may not sit right and look the way it's supposed to. So make sure to pay attention to your pattern, or just have a few on hand so you can test, maybe test it on yourself or a dress form, and you can kind of see that it's going to fit nice. Just pin it in first and try it on and see how it looks, and kind of experiment with what look you like. There is no reason not to put in shoulder pads. If you do go extreme, of course it's going to look extreme with the thickness, but if you do like a normal shoulder pad, 1/2 inch, 3/4 is usually pretty fine. It just gives a lot of structure to the top and makes the sleeves and shoulders sit properly, so please do not forego these shoulder pads. They're really important. And your placement is really important as well. You want to make sure that the edge of the shoulder pad is actually going into the sleeve cap. So you can put it into the edge of your seam allowance or a little bit further. It just helps to make that ease kind of roll over and sit out, so that your sleeve doesn't kind of make the ease and then just like drop really flat. It makes it kind of roll out. Another option that you can do is cut sort of a curved shape out of some like fleece or quilt batting. So it's kind of like thicker in the middle and it comes out like this to a point, and you're going to put that along your seam allowance of your sleeve cap. So it's kind of go from like where your ease starts and your ease ends at your back and your front, and that widest part is going to be in the middle, and then the points kind of come down, so it's kind of pointy, comes wide, and comes pointy at the back again. And that width is going to point in to your sleeve cap and kind of make it sit out better. Now I'm not going to open up this coat because it's, you know, all finished. So I can kind of show you with this one here. My sleeve seam is here, and I can feel that fleece piece that I put inside of this one comes out to about here. So I can feel that thickness in there. It comes down to down here in the back, and it comes down to down here in the front. So a little bit further down. And it just makes that ease kind of roll out. It has something to follow instead of making the sleeve kind of drop down. Especially if your fabric's not very thick, it kind of just wants to fall. It kind of gives it that kind of round shape, which is what you want the shoulder to sit. So in school, when we made our jackets and coats, we had something like this for that purpose, and it was cut into strips. And I completely forget what this is called. If I can find the name in my sewing book, I will insert it. But it's almost got like a webbing on the inside, and then it's kind of like a batting at the same time. And that was what we would sew into our seam allowance, like here, and then this part would stick into the shoulder cap. But if you don't have any of that lying around, in the past I've just used like a quilt batting. It's around the same thickness, and this is cut into like a 1.5 inch strip, whereas this I cut into more of like a pointy, wide to pointy strip, so that it kind of goes in with the seam allowance where it matches up at the front and the back. So I would kind of start pointy here, like slowly grade out into my width, and then come down pointy again. It would obviously be longer than that to fit my shoulder cap, but just take a few measurements and then that will work. If you have a cheap shoulder pad, I'll show you two different ones. So the ones that I've found at Fabricland are very cheap. They're nice for very simple coats, but they don't have the width and the coverage that a properly made shoulder pad has. So you can do something similar with the cheap ones and add to it to make it higher quality with quilt batting like I have here. And the quilt batting is like a fleeced quilt batting. It's not very loose, if that makes sense. Like, it's very tight, almost like a felt. You can use felt as well, but I'll show you the differences between that. So this is what I would call your cheap shoulder pad. It's just very simple foam inside of like a stretch knit fabric, and it's just serged together on the edge. This is a 1/2 inch shoulder pad, very simple, but it's not going to give that much support, and it's not very big. If you hold up a proper shoulder pad, this is what it looks like. Many layers of felt in there, and this I believe is also a 1/2 inch. So you've got all of the batting and everything inside. You've got a notch in the middle, so you know your front and back. So the longer side goes towards your back. And it's all been felted together, like needle punched. And you've got a few layers of felt together. So if you can't get your hands on these, because they can be a little bit more difficult to find depending on what places you have around you or online. I actually haven't looked online for these, so it might be a good spot. You can take one of these and get some felt or tight batting like this one, and cut out a larger shape of your shoulder pad to go over the top and bottom of this one, and it just gives you a better coverage. So as you can see on the bottom here, this one is a little bit shorter, and then the one on top is wider, so it gives a more seam line finish from the top. So if you guys maybe want to see a video on how you can do that, let me know down in the comments and I'll see if I can make that really soon. It's super easy to do, but especially if you can't access those really nice quality shoulder pads, it's so easy to just buy those cheap ones and just have some batting on hand and make some higher quality ones, and you just hand stitch it together. It's super easy. And then you also want to remember to get the proper shoulder pad. So if you have a raglan sleeve, you're going to need a raglan shoulder pad, and if you have a regular set-in sleeve, then you need a set-in sleeve shoulder pad. And you also want to make sure that you're sewing it in properly. So again, like I said earlier, you want it to stick out into your shoulder cap a little bit. With that little fleece piece will just help make your cap roll really nicely. But you also don't want to sew it in with a sewing machine, because it's going to put dips into your batting and shoulder pad, and it's going to create a dip in your shoulder. So you just want to lightly hand sew it in to your seam allowance by going up and down with your needle really, really lightly. You're not pulling it tight or anything. Up and down on your cap seam allowance, and then wherever it reaches up your shoulder seam, you want to tack it up here. So that's kind of how you can keep your shoulder pad in place. You can also lightly sew it kind of in like a zigzag motion, like long stitches, up and down your shoulder seam allowance underneath, but I usually just tack it at the end and then have my tacking going up my cap, and then it's fine. So the next thing I guess I can mention is tacking. Tacking is really important, especially if your coat is fully lined. There are a ton of places to tack to make your coat sit properly and make sure that your lining is not shifting up and down to the point where you can see it from the outside. So a lot of different places that you can tack are along your hem. So if you hand stitch your hem up of your outer fabric and you have your lining attached to that, it's good to kind of tack it up a little bit higher, or tack that seam where your lining and your outer fabric is attached to the seams that you have going along your coat. So for example, on this coat here, this one's fully lined right to the bottom, and I've got my lining sewn right to my outer fabric. And let me just find a seam here. Here's my side seam. So I've got it sewn with my ease tuck, and I've also got it tacked. So if I pull it here, it's tacked right in there, if you can see. So I've got that seam allowance tacked there, so it's not going to go anywhere. Another place to tack is your underarms, and you want to make sure that your seam allowance is pointing up into your sleeve, so those will get tacked together. You can see I'm pulling it and it's not going anywhere. It's also good to tack up here where your shoulder seam meets your cap, so you want to tack your lining to where your shoulder pad and everything is there. Another place to tack is your sleeve hem, just like you would your lower hem. So on this coat I did a sleeve facing, and this part is tacked here. So you can see there. So that way it'll just make sure that your ease tuck won't go lower than your sleeve, as long as you've drafted it correctly. And if you have any pockets, so in the one I'm working on now has some side seam pockets, I'm going to make sure that from the inside, let me find it here, there's my pocket. I don't want it just flying around in there, I want it to face the way it's supposed to be facing. So before I finish, I'm going to take a little piece of twill tape or a scrap piece of my fabric, sew it right to the edge of my pocket here, and I'm going to tack it in here to my seam allowance where my center front meets my facing. And it'll just hold it facing that direction towards the front, so it won't kind of flop around inside. And if you have a free lining, so it's not attached at the bottom, you want to make sure to do any swing tacks, like a crocheted swing tack with multiple strands of thread or embroidery thread, to make sure that your lining is going to not stray too far away from your side seams or your center back. Those are usually main places that you will put swing tacks. Another thing to think about is your closure. How are you going to close your coat? So on this one, I went for these really beautiful snaps. And that is the only closure I have on this coat. And then the other side, there's the other half. So really beautiful snaps, and that just makes sure that it's closed properly, but also it's very streamlined from the front. So when it's done up, you just see the pattern of the fabric. I didn't want to take away from the pattern of the fabric, so that's why I just put snaps. So it's actually cool the way I did this coat, because this is one side of the fabric, and then I actually used the other side for my center front. So it's kind of opposite in the way that the fabric is woven. So for my pink coat, I'm actually going to use the same snaps but in gold, and then on top I'm going to put some gold buttons. So it kind of eliminates me from doing buttonholes, because I know I can do them. I know it's perfectly fine to do them, but if I can avoid doing buttonholes, I will 100% avoid them. So that's how I'm going to get around that. So just make sure if you are going to do buttonholes, make sure to put extra interfacing on the inside, something to reinforce that area. And yeah, so that's why this is just the way it is. That's why I used just the stretch interfacing for my outside and my center front facing, because I wasn't going to be putting any buttonholes. I was just going to be putting snaps and buttons. It didn't need to be like super strong. Same thing if you're going to be putting in a zipper. I would definitely recommend to make sure to reinforce that area and definitely use a good quality zipper. And the other thing you need to think about is if you are doing a fully lined coat, think about how you're going to do your darts. So in school I learned to just sew them as tucks or tuck pleats, because that way you still have the extra movement of the lining and you're not completely restricting the entire dart. You're still allowing it to have movement of your lining. So for example, in my front here, my front lining had 2 darts, but instead of sewing up the entire dart, you just sew it up part way and you leave the top and the bottom open so you have these tucks. That way you have extra movement of the fabric and your lining won't pull on the inside. Other places that you want to leave ease tucks are the center back lining of your coat. So in this one here, I've sewn down a little tuck pleat here, and then you've got, this is open, so you've got extra movement in your back for your shoulders to move around. You've got your ease tuck on your sleeve, so you've got about like a 1/2 inch tuck there, well, 1 inch altogether. So your lining can move up and down your sleeve when you move your arm, but it's not going to ever come lower than your actual sleeve. You're going to do the same at the bottom. So I've got that as well on here. You can see where it attaches with my facing. It's right into my facing there on the front. And that just allows your lining to move, and it won't let the outside of the fabric pull in any way. It's just free, and both of them are sitting nicely when you wear it. Another thing to do, especially if you have a super thick fabric, is to grade your seam allowances. Especially if you're going to be top stitching your facing, under stitching, anything like that. It can get super thick in those areas. So definitely grade your seam allowances. So what I mean by that is when you sew, say you're facing to your center front and you go to understitch that area, it's going to be very thick. So I like to understitch first and then grade my seam allowances. When you go to iron it, you can kind of get that big bulk in there, and sometimes you can get a big line showing where the bulk is. So you want to take 1/2 of your seam allowances and cut them in half, and then leave the other one at its original, so it kind of creates like a grade down and you won't have that big thick chunk in there. So I'll show you on my pink coat. So I've done that here on my front facing. So this is my center front, and I have understitched it, and I've cut down 1/2 of my seam allowance in half. So it creates that grade down, and then when I have it right side out, it won't be as thick down my center front. You kind of have a thinner profile when you press it, and if I decide to top stitch it, it won't be so thick. This is especially important if you're sewing with a thick wool or any type of thicker fabric. It will really help you when doing your finishing and your pressing. Now, speaking of pressing when making jackets and coats, press as you go. It is so important to press as you go. Press everything you're doing, whether it needs to be pressed open, towards the side, towards the back. Just being able to steam your shoulder cap with a ham, steaming your collar with a ham so that it sits in place and you're kind of setting the fabric to be in that position. it's super important. So make sure to press as you go, because if you get too much of it sewn together, it's going to be a lot harder to get your sleeve hem in, your regular hem, any type of sleeve roll in. It's going to be a lot more difficult to get into those areas that you need to press. And always use a pressing cloth. If you're going to press from the top or your outer fabric, make sure to use a pressing cloth, especially with wool, because you do not want to damage it. And I think those are all the tips that I have today for making jackets and coats. I'm actually going to go through my sewing book again and see if there's anything else, and I might make a part 2, especially when I'm done making my coat. It was one of my goals this month to finish it in October, and I'm not quite done it. It's now November, but I think this is a good start anyways, and I love making jackets and coats. They're just so exciting, and it's just such a statement piece to have in your wardrobe, whether it's for yourself or someone else. They're just great, and you can personalize them however you want, and I think because it's an outerwear thing, it can really make a first impression and kind of tell your personality. So they're so cool. I love making them, and there's a lot of techniques and extra things that you need to do with jacket and coat making, so it's a really special item to work on, especially if you're a beginner sewer. It can teach you a lot when making jackets or coats, so I definitely recommend, if you haven't made one before, just start with a simple pattern and just go for it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I think the rest of the day I'm going to spend trying to finish this coat because I really want it done, and try and get my sojo back in the process, because I haven't really been sewing that much lately, but I really want to finish it so I can wear it. So I will post it on Instagram when I'm finished. I'm also thinking about filming a Make 9 updates video, but I might wait till the end of November-ish, because that's one of my goals this month, is to work on my Make 9, because I've only done 3 things, including this coat, which isn't done yet. So I'm going to try my best to work on those, and work on some Christmas DIY and ideas, and just start kind of planning out the rest of the year. So I'm going to go try and get my sojo back the rest of the day. I hope you guys have a fabulous week, and I'll see you next time, crafters. Bye!